Good morning, and thank you so much for joining Advocates for Ohio's Future and the Center for Community Solutions Budget Training Academy. This is the third in our series. We'll get started in just a moment as we allow folks to come in from that waiting room. We're happy we're here. A couple housekeeping and frequently asked questions to get us started. This presentation will be recorded and will be available on Advocates for Ohio's Future's website, probably later this afternoon, if not first thing tomorrow. We'll of course send the slides and the recording out to everyone who registered. So you can go back and listen to all these incredible presentations we have lined up. I'm really excited to be joined today by a number of Advocates for Ohio's Future partner organizations, a group of really incredible advocates who are certainly experts in their field. And I'm just excited to hear from and learn from them for the rest of the morning. So folks, we will go ahead and kick things off. Once again, my name is Kelsey Berkfeld. I'm the Director of Advocates for Ohio's Future, of course, joined by my colleague, Sarah Hudasak, the Policy and Communications Assistant for AOF. And together, we are AOF and we keep the train running. And really, as AOF, we are a broad-based health and human services a coalition. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization of policy folks, of researchers, of providers, and just really passionate advocates of people who are interested in the health and well-being of families and Ohioans across our state, and also joined by an understanding that lots of our special sectors and issues are intersectional. When we look to make real improvements in the well-being, again, health of families and Ohioans, knowing that all of the issues that we work on, again, are crucial and vital to make sure that people can advance and have opportunities to succeed in our great state. Just a brief overview of some of the issue areas and experts that we have on Advocates for Ohio Steering Committee. Of course, we have folks who specialize in access to physical and behavioral health care, nutrition support, safe and affordable housing, services for older adults and people with disabilities, expanded home and community-based services, early childhood care and education, workforce development, broadband access and affordability, and of course, transportation. The list continues. If you name something, I'm sure we know a little bit about it, and also wanted to share just the leadership of Advocates for Ohio's Future. This is our executive committee. We have about 30 steering committee organizations. Again, it's so great to be able to join with so many different organizations, again, to work for some common and similar goals. And we know when we work and we advocate at the state level, whether it's budget time or not budget time, it's really important for legislators and elected officials, decision makers, if you hear the same thing over and over again, you hear the same priorities, of course, it's going to have a larger impact on that kind of advocacy scale. So that is what I really enjoy. And I believe that this coalition is really special, that we are able to come around every 2 years. Of course, we talk between, of course, outside of budget time, but that we can come together around a list of guiding principles and priorities and really work together to move those forward. Next slide, please. Excellent. So it is the end of September, coming up here in October before a state budget year, and wanted to share AOF's priorities from the last General Assembly. Current General Assembly, I will say, we worked on these as a group, as a coalition, again, probably fall of 2 years ago. We were talking about really what are the greatest needs for Ohioans across the state, and really where those issues are that could certainly use a boost. What's really special about AOF, again, with Sarah and I's work, can be concentrated to, of course, echo and amplify the work of our partner organizations, but also we come up with our own policy agenda. We intend to fill gaps and provide leadership on different policy areas that maybe some of our partner organizations don't have the capacity to cover. And we, of course, take on that policy expertise and that work and that strategy. And we really lead on a number of those issues. So a couple of those that we chose to lead on, again, with this current General Assembly, of course, maintain Medicaid eligibility without barriers or cuts. So we were successful so far in this General Assembly to maintain Medicaid eligibility. Of course, a couple other factors, including the federal public health emergency and some provisions that are tied to that in terms of eligibility and redetermination have also helped, but we were also excited to see some success in the last budget cycle of expanding Medicaid coverage to postpartum mothers after birth for up to a year after birth, which is fantastic. Used to be just about 60 days. So we were really happy to see that expansion and that coverage extended to those new parents. We know that that is going to be really impactful, and we're excited to see the outcomes from that policy change. Of course, increased access and affordability of broadband and improved digital literacy. We saw a really significant investment in the broadband residential expansion program in the state budget. We saw about $250 million that were included in the last state budget. We also know that there's a lot of funding streams and additional resources coming down from the federal government across a number of bills to really, again, continue to enhance Ohio's broadband system and ensure that every Ohioan has access to broadband. Now, here at AOF, we want to take that a step further and make sure that broadband is affordable for folks, because we want to make sure that people can access it. And we also have those devices to access the internet is vitally important. I think the pandemic showed everyone, of course, how important connectivity is, whether it be through work, through healthcare, through schooling, and really just connecting with folks. So we are working with our state partners to ensure that affordability and digital literacy, so making sure folks know how to use those programs, these devices, to have the best and most efficient use of broadband and of internet connectivity moving forward. I think that's something that we're going to expand upon in the next legislative section and the next budget cycle. And of course, support the immediate emergency needs of low-income children and families by investing in the core components of the TANF program, or temporary aid for needy families. So these are families, really, really low-income families who can receive different services through different programs provided by the state and coordinated by our county Jobs and Family Services agencies. There are a number of supports, whether it be Ohio Works First or through PRC prevention, retention, and contingency funds to really help families who find themselves on the brink, who maybe need a little extra leg up on some issues, maybe a little help with rent, or there's some car maintenance that needs to be done to allow those families to get to work, to get to school, a little leg up when families are in need. So looking to continue to support the TANF program, making sure that those dollars are going to the neediest families. We will, of course, continue those conversations in the next General Assembly. And then we also have some standing work groups within Advocates for House Futures Coalition. Of course, TANF, broadband, work and wages, and equity. We are strong proponents of the Minority Health Strike Report that came out in 2020 as a response that, of course, highlighted and more pronounced disparate impacts of the pandemic on minority populations. We are looking to hopefully see some of those recommendations implemented in the next state budget. Next slide, please. So something that's really going to impact the next state budget, as well as a lot of the work of Advocates for Ohio's Future and our partners, comes down from the federal public health emergency. So this is a declaration that has been in place since January of 2020 at the very, very start of the pandemic. And tied to it are a number of flexibilities of expanded benefits and such that are tied to public programs in the state of Ohio. Right now, the public federal health emergency, or the PHE, as I will refer to it moving forward, is renewed every 90 days by the Federal Department of Health and Human Services. Right now, the current federal PHE is set to expire on October 13th. However, the Biden administration has promised a 60-day lead up to the expiration of that health emergency. And we did not receive that notification. If we were going to receive it, it would have been in August, about a month ago. Did not receive it, so we can hopefully very, very confidently assume that the federal public health emergency will be renewed another 90 days in October. And so we will see that last through mid-January of 2023. So that is a good thing, at least in AOF's opinion, in my opinion, knowing that this gives us a little extra time to prepare for what that means and the impact it's going to have on families who, again, still rely on these public programs, who continue to qualify for public programs, who may still be struggling to to stabilize after the emergency or the public health emergency and the responding economic crisis. So we are calling the end of the federal public health emergency, or PHE, the COVID cliff. And again, lots of families, lots of low-income families and Ohioans will feel the impact of it moving forward. Next slide, please. So this is something that we worked on for the past year, really, with Advocates for Ohio's Future and our partners. We convened the Ohio COVID Recovery Coalition. So we brought different partners from around the state to talk about really the impacts that the end of the PHE are going to have on Ohioans, making sure that we have all the waivers and we have a kind of a game plan of all the changes that are going to happen. And we have really worked closely with the administration, with other partners, stakeholders, community organizations over the past year to create a good plan to inform folks of those changes that are going to happen, as well as make a plan to inform recipients who rely on some of these programs of the changes that could happen. They will be really widespread, and they could certainly have potential harmful impacts, whether it be through loss of Medicaid health insurance or a significant loss of SNAP or nutrition assistance benefits, really all at once. It's all going to kind of hit families once that federal PHE expires. So we wanted to make sure that we are as prepared as possible, that we're working closely with the administration, with the General Assembly, as well as community organizations who we know folks are going to turn to first for that help and maybe for that initial or additional boost of support once some of those changes take place. So looking for the next slide here. Thank you so much. So very quickly, a slide from our friends at the Center for Community Solutions. So Medicaid, of course, is going to have a major redetermination. So the full Medicaid caseload will be redetermined for eligibility at the end of the federal PHE. This will certainly have widespread impacts. So the redeterminations have not been in place or have not happened really since March of 2020. So we do have some additional folks on the Medicaid program. If they were deemed eligible, they are now on the rolls and they have not been removed unless they have changed states or they've requested to be removed from those roles. So we will see a large amount of folks be removed from those programs. Again, we hope that those folks have gained meaningful employment that includes health insurance and health coverage. Hopefully there's not many problems with the system with those redeterminations, but we do expect anywhere between 400,000 to 700,000 Ohioans to be removed from those Medicaid rolls. And I've actually heard in the past few weeks from some of our partners, it could be upwards of 1 million Ohioans off of the Medicaid rolls once that redetermination process takes place. So that is a significant loss of folks. Again, we hope that the majority of those folks have gained employment and have private coverage through their employer, but we also want to make sure that those services and those navigator services are strong to allow folks to a little bit of assistance to enroll in the private marketplace or in the public marketplace through the ACA, which would be, we advocate for all folks to have health insurance, but we want to make sure those assistance services, those navigator programs are strong. We also want to make sure if folks feel like they've been removed from the Medicaid rolls wrongly, that they have their due process rights are fulfilled and that there is a legal services available to support them through their appeals process. Again, we want to make sure that folks who are eligible for these programs remain on those programs as easily as possible. So if there are any changes or issues to be dealt with, we want to make sure that there is a legal service and process to be followed. Coming up next, again, because folks have been on those Medicaid rolls without a lot of communication or touches from our county jobs and family services or really eligibility caseworkers, we know that folks have moved. Lots of folks have moved throughout the pandemic. It's been almost 3 years at this point, my goodness. So we want to make sure that folks have their contact information up to date within those county systems so that when counties do communicate these changes or actions need to be taken for redetermination across Medicaid or any public program, that they can reach those recipients again as effectively as possible. And those recipients can, again, fulfill any needs or requirements necessary to remain eligible and they have all that information again up to date. So this is a slide that we have, or from the Department of Medicaid, that we've been sharing through AOF. You know, our partners as well have been promoting this slide again as options for folks to make sure that their information is up to date and that they can receive, again, notification of those changes coming in those public programs. Next slide. Of course, another big issue that we have been keeping track of within the COVID cliff would be within the SNAP program. When the public health emergency was declared, the federal government made the decision to allow emergency allotments or maximum emergency allotments within the SNAP program to allow all SNAP recipients to receive the maximum amount allowed for their family size for food benefits. Again, these have been in place since March of 2020, and this again has impacted all the SNAP recipients in Ohio. So this has increased about $80 per month per family member. Within the SNAP program, has added $120 million per month of food assistance in the state of Ohio. Again, those dollars are being invested in our grocery stores, making sure that families have what they need for nutrition support, that they're healthy, that they can continue to work and go to school with healthy, nutritious food. When the public health emergency ends, there will be a 30-day grace period, probably one more emergency allotment distribution, and then those resources will discontinue. So again, those will certainly be felt by families, especially at a time when inflation and supply chain issues have really impacted the prices of food at our grocery stores. We know that the reliance on food banks for additional support for families is at an all-time high. And we also know that our food banks are facing some struggles as well in securing those food and securing those resources and make sure that folks are fed. So these are two of the major changes that we've discussed again within Advocates for Ohio's Future. These changes will again come to fruition at the end of the federal public health emergency in the next General Assembly, and will certainly start to be felt if it does end in January around state budget time. So there will be lots of considerations for folks and for maybe some additional supports within these systems and within these supports. Next slide, please. Cool. Thanks. We can probably move to the next one. Excellent. This is just a snapshot look at really some of the impacts that families are going to feel for the end of the PHE and SNAP. As you can see, really large dollar amounts of losses for different family sizes and groups. We can go to the next one. Thank you. So again, single parent who's working will also see a lot of big changes. And really the next slide that I want to highlight is the impact that will be felt by our older adults on the SNAP program. They have seen probably the biggest increases in nutrition and food support with these maximum allotments. And again, we are working with our partners to make sure that folks who will feel the changes and the impacts are prepared and they can maybe plan ahead for these reduction in benefits. Moving forward to really the culmination of our work with the Ohio COVID Recovery Coalition, looking for an investment to help kind of cushion that COVID cliff. This is something that AOF and our partners have been advocating for the past few months, and will continue, of course, through the next General Assembly. Immediate investment to help cushion that COVID cliff in food supports and making sure our county jobs and family services are ready to take on all that eligibility work and be there to answer the phone for questions for folks who are eligible for these programs, in-person assisters, making sure that our legal aid services, as well as our navigator systems, are strong and ready to support those folks, as well as making sure those community organizations, those direct care service nonprofits that have been such a lifeline over the past almost 3 years, are strong and ready to help those folks through, again, that period of crisis. So this is something that as AOF we've put together, and this would be our first American Rescue Plan Act ask. This is our kind of COVID cliff proposal, really tied into our greater American Rescue Plan Act tracking and advocacy plan here at AOF. So this is something that we work together specifically with our partners at the Ohio Poverty Law Center to pull together an online tracker tool, as well as an accompanying report to show really where those federal dollars, massive amounts of federal dollars, have flown or have flowed through from the federal government to the states to local communities and cities. $13.3 billion in the past 2.5 years. Certainly a lot of dollars that have come in, really flexible uses to support, again, a strong and equitable recovery from the pandemic. So we have when we came together to talk about this tracker, we want to answer those questions about how much money has been allocated for what purpose and what has been spent to date, how the spending was authorized, especially at the state level via the controlling board or through the General Assembly, as well as how much money is left. And moving forward, we can see here from our slide and through the tracking of our partners and through, especially I'm going to highlight Sarah Hudasek, incredible tracking skills of these dollars that have been certainly hard to find. Those paper trails have been buried a little bit. Looking at how much money is left from the American Rescue Plan Act for the state specifically to use as it see fits, again, to support a strong recovery from the pandemic. Ohio received $5.37 billion in American Rescue Plan Act dollars, really flexible. And to date, there is almost $2 billion left. So we would imagine that these dollars would be allocated again in the next state budget cycle. The governor has, of course, indicated that he would like to see these dollars be spent on one-time funds. We would argue especially for our proposal, that these would be a one-time kind of crisis intervention investment. But in the next slide, you'll see kind of where Ohio has prioritize that funding and those dollars so far. Of course, we can see the largest allocation going to unemployment stabilization, and then we have some allocations and some money spent on water safety, on public safety, on sewer quality, parks, trails, and then we do have a couple investments in pediatric behavioral health care, as well as a significant investment in the Appalachian Community Grant Program, which is getting off the ground, looking to see what great things that will come to fruition. And then very last, as what we are looking as AOF towards lame duck and moving into the next state budget cycle. Of course, so this is a bill, Senate Bill 17 is a bill that really would impact eligibility across a large amount of public programs. This is a bill that we're continuing to keep our eyes on. Some provisions of it were added during the state budget last cycle. Those were removed for independent consideration. We could expect or would expect some of these provisions to be up for consideration during lame duck. And really what happened in the state budget cycle as the compromise to remove them from the budget was the Public Assistance Benefits Accountability Task Force has been meeting to look at eligibility to look at integrity within public programs, and they are looking to make recommendations in the next year. And we are also looking at the publicly funded Child Care Study Committee and Step Up to Quality Study Committee. We know that childcare is an incredible work support, and we know that issues like workforce capacity are major conversations to make sure that folks have a safe and safe childcare and affordable childcare to make sure that folks can get back on their feet and get back in the workforce and continue to recover from the pandemic. So that was a big mouthful from me, and I want to thank you for your attention. I'm really excited to introduce our first speaker again, a lineup of incredible AOF press to talk to you about what they've been working on in the past year and to give their insights into the state budget process, and as well as some advocacy tips from really experienced and excellent advocates. I'm really excited and I'm very happy to be able to work with them so closely. And I am excited to introduce our first speaker, Nick Bates from One Ohio Now. So Nick, whenever you're ready, please take it away.
Thank you, Kelsey, and thank you to Advocates for Ohio's Future and Center for Community Solutions for having me on today. One Ohio Now is a statewide coalition that believes great public services strengthen our communities, and we need the revenues to pay for them. Revenue is one of those issues that connects all of our other issues. It is, revenue is often discussed in ways and means because it is the way and the process that we are able to pay and fund all of the other community services and public investments that we all advocate for. Kelsey, one of your in your opening remarks, you made a comment that I wrote down about why being part of a coalition and working collectively is so important. You said that our legislators need to hear the same thing over and over again. And this is one of the struggles with revenue because it's sort of all of our issue, but at the same time, we often see it as a different issue, something outside of where we're experts at. But the reality is we all are experts on revenue because we're experts on the things that the revenue pays for. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So if you've never seen this chart before, here it is. This is where the state gets our revenue from. There are three main sources in Ohio: the federal government through TANF and Medicaid and these other grants that the state receives funding from the feds. The second area is our state sales tax, and the third is our state income tax. So as we look at our main operating budget, we can see that the vast majority of our funding comes from these three sources. So proposals that will eliminate the income tax or eliminate other or reduce income taxes or provide loopholes and tax expenditures will begin to very quickly eat away at the resources that we have to invest in our communities. One thing I do want to point out here real quick is that the income and sales tax used to be flipped. We used to actually generate more money from the income tax than we did the sales tax. But about 8 or so years ago, they flipped because of what we like to call the tax shift. Next slide, please. So the tax shift, it was the kind of the series of policy changes that began all the way back in 2005, where we've cut income taxes, we've raised sales taxes, we've shifted the tax load from the wealthy to the rest of us and from the state to our local communities. This has meant that we have had 10 income tax rate cuts over that time. We've increased our sales tax, which impacts low and middle income folks more than the income tax does. We haven't really addressed our tax loopholes, and we've created new ones over that time to benefit the wealthy and the well-connected. And then finally, we've had broken promises to local communities, cuts to the local government fund, the estate tax, tangible personal property tax commitments, and the 12.5% property tax rollback. All of these things are very nuanced and can get kind of confusing, but if you've had to work on a senior service levy or children's service levy in your local community, you become very quickly aware of how the state policy decisions are impacting our local communities. And because of some of the great research at Policy Matters, we know that's been about an $8 billion loss. So some people get a little confused about how the income tax in Ohio works. So we know that in the last budget, we saw 3% is what they said across the board income tax cut, but that's not really what we saw. What we saw was the lowest income Ohioans basically got no tax cut, because you see that they increased the minimum amount you have to make to pay any state income tax, but things like the earned income tax credit that AOF and many of us have advocated for many years basically eliminated that tax liability for low-income taxpayers already. But then if you go ahead and hit the forward, you can see our top tax rate there, pre-pandemic or pre the 2021 tax cuts. And then go ahead and hit a few more times, and you can see what ended up happening by eliminating brackets. This is called flattening the tax code. Go ahead and hit it one more time. You can see that this is actually a 16% income tax cut. So the lowest income Ohioans basically saw no tax cut. Middle income Ohioans saw a very marginal one, and the wealthiest Ohioans on that income that they had over $217,000, they saw a 16% rate cut. Next slide, please. And as we can see here, what have all these tax cuts over the past 18 years meant for our communities? We have seen a massive cut when we look at inflation to resources available to spend in our communities. So this is non-Medicaid health and human service spending. When you look at, based on the data from the Legislative Services Commission, you can see we've cut over $500 million since 2005 alone. Next slide. Similarly with higher education, people are wondering, why is college so expensive? We have failed to continue to invest in our system of public education, higher education in Ohio. And next slide. And the all-important K-12 school funding that many of us, is one of the central themes of our state budget. We've never really been able to make the investments that we need. And since 2005, we have failed to keep up with basic inflation, let alone the new investments that we know are needed to make all of our schools great. Next slide. And all of these tax cuts and tax policy changes were done in the name of job growth, But as we can see, when we begin in 2005 and look at the rate of job growth over time, the US has had ups and downs. Sure, the Great Recession, the pandemic, and so has Ohio. But Ohio's recovery has been slower because as we think about it, when we could be reinvesting after economic downturns, we're cutting taxes. We're using that extra revenue not to hire more teachers, more social workers, more park rangers and people to maintain our state parks and roads and bridges. Instead, we're cutting taxes. Next slide. And the reality is the threat is not over. Currently in the General Assembly, there are two bills that are pending. The first is House Bill 234. This will eliminate the state commercial activity tax, which generates about $2 billion a year. So imagine if this was eliminated, what that would mean for our community services and the programs and the funding that we receive if there was $2 billion less. Now, I always like to point out with these proposals that this is pass the buck budgeting because they are not eliminating it entirely right away. Instead, they are phasing in the tax cut over time so that the hard decisions are pushed down the road to future General Assemblies. And the second proposal is eliminating the state income tax. This would be over 10 years. This would be an $11.2 billion cut to public resources available in Ohio. Remember, back to one of those original slides, the state income tax represents about 26% of our general operating budget. So imagine if all of our programs lost 26% of our state funding. That would be a massive hit to all of our public investments. Next slide. But I don't think it needs to stay this way. I think we have an opportunity to push back. And the first way we can do this is having a vision. Now, sometimes fighting to avoid cuts and maintain the status quo is a lot of work. I've been doing budget and tax policy work for more than a decade now. And maintaining the status quo is a fight. But we also have to make sure our legislators and policymakers know what will it take to solve some of our most pressing needs. How many more social workers do we need in our schools? How many more drug treatment facilities and programs and drug and rehab counselors do we need throughout the state, especially in underserved communities? What is it going to take? You all have the ability to begin to answer those questions. The next point that I recommend is to connect the dots. How do we make sure that we are talking about sustainable and adequate revenue for not just this budget, but into the long term? So when you're doing your advocacy, comes back to that idea that just a few, if all of us kind of bring it up, say, and don't cut the income tax, make sure we have sustainable revenues into the future, protect our diverse revenue streams. If we continue to all do that, then it helps legislators understand that, oh, this income tax, which is over here, actually matters to our social service and health and human services over here. They intersect. And finally, educate your members and coalition partners. I laugh, my 12-year-old will go out and buy things, or want to order something online and be like, wait a second, I got to spend an extra $1.25 on that for sales tax? Yeah, you do. And they get a little upset at me sometimes that I don't pick up that tab for them. But the reality is, it's like, yes, Sammy, you enjoy the park, you enjoy your school, you enjoy us driving you places on those publicly funded roads. So we have to make sure that our community members understand how the taxes and the revenues that are generated impact our community services and what is going to happen if we lose those revenues, because in the end, it's very little change for most Ohioans. What we see then are the impact as the taxes are shifted from the wealthy to the rest of us and from the state to our local communities. Final slide, please. I believe Ohio can be the best place to raise a family, but we need to make sure we're investing in the foundations of that community, and feel free to reach out with any questions that folks have about budget and tax policies that we can help with.
Nick, thank you so much for your comments. I know the state budget just the revenue side of things is a lot to think about when we think about how just many dollars we're thinking about, billions and billions and billions of dollars. Thank you for your comments. We're going to take some questions at the end. So if you have some time to stay on, we'd love for you to join us. Also wanted to just inform folks, we did turn on live captioning at the bottom, so you can follow along with our speakers. Next, I want to introduce Gina Wilt, who's going to talk to us about housing and homelessness and affordable housing in Ohio. So Gina, happy to have you. Please go ahead whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Kelsey, and thanks for hosting this event. And you gave me a hard act to follow. Always appreciate Nick's great advice and wisdom. So appreciate you, Nick, and thanks again, Kelsey and AOF for hosting this. So my name is Gina Wilt, and I'm the Advocacy Director for the Coalition on Homelessness and Housing in Ohio. And COHIO partners with local organizations to end homelessness and to promote affordable housing. We have a great homeless management information systems team, and so we have lots of information. We also work with Ohio Housing Finance Agency and comb through their research to be able to provide data information on homelessness in Ohio. So over the course of a year, we have about 70,000 Ohioans who access our homeless services. We have two rising subpopulations, seniors and children, including close to 3,000 homeless babies over the course of a year. So that's infants under the age of 1 who have needed homeless services. We also have a housing insecurity crisis. So low income, very low income, extremely low income renters are facing housing insecurity. 3 out of 4 at-risk households eligible for housing assistance do not get that help that they need. So that is 1 of 4 households that actually qualify for housing assistance get it. So on this next slide, you're right on. So about 400,000 families here in the Buckeye State spend about over 50% of their income on rent. Housing costs are definitely leaving our neighbors on the edge, whether it's a car wreck or health issue, job loss, whatever it is, one thing can definitely lead to an eviction notice on their door. So on this slide here, you'll see that rents have been rising much faster than incomes, especially in our low-wage jobs. Low-wage jobs are actually the most commonly available jobs. So those are the jobs that we have here in Ohio. Only a couple of the out of all these jobs you'll see here, only a couple really help people to afford a 2-bedroom apartment comfortably. Afford a 2-bedroom apartment. So full-time workers need about $17.05 per hour to afford a 2-bedroom apartment in Ohio. This report is called the Out of Reach report. We do it every year, and every year it does change. This year it did change more dramatically than years past. So we're definitely higher state housing wage. And you'll see there is a significant gap between there's significant gaps all over the place, whether you're in Columbus or you're in Union County or you're in Hamilton County. The housing wage is actually higher in the urban and suburban areas, but the gap between rents and wages are wider in the rural areas. So think Athens, Brown, Fairfield, Hawking, Geauga. Those areas have a bigger gap. So, and then on the next slide, you'll see that while wages have increased a little bit, which is good, of course, there's still issues that are going faster and faster even than the pre-pandemic levels. So I think these pictures are quite dramatic. You'll see the 2-bedroom goes straight up. And then on the eviction case filings, you'll see there was a dip around early May, and that was when there were those moratoriums on evictions. You'll see it didn't go down to 0 because people were still evicting during those moratoriums, but it did dip down to a little bit under 2,000. But we are back up to monthly, about 10,000 evictions every month. So let's see, the average cost of renting a 2-bedroom in Ohio increased 12.6% over the past year and about 21.4% in the past 2 years. So I think we're going to go to the next slide. So where do we go from here? What do we do? So of course we have, this is a crisis and we need long-term systems changes. We need long-term investments, dedicated long-term investments. But there are also some things that we can do right now. The Coalition on Homelessness and Housing is leading an effort to use ARPA dollars for affordable housing. We've been urging the DeWine administration as well as the Ohio legislature to invest $308 million of the $5.6 billion from the state and local fiscal recovery fund to housing. So we have it broken down here on the slide, and you'll see also that the business community has joined in supporting this request. I think that investing in affordable housing is something that they are starting to understand, which is great. I think they've always understood it. I think that it's just becoming a bigger issue for the business community. They, like we are saying, they're also saying that investing in affordable housing infrastructure through new construction, preservation, that's going to bolster productivity. It's going to bolster growth. It's going to provide long-term assets, homes for people so they can actually be a part of their communities, that they can support the local job creation efforts, which we all know there's a lot of that going on in Ohio right now. And so the connection between housing and economic development is very clear, like roads and bridges and any other infrastructure. We need this asset to help communities and families to thrive. So increasing the supply of affordable housing, especially in areas that are connected to well-paying jobs, healthcare, transportation, schools. We want to help families climb the economic ladder, and housing is foundational to all of that. So what's on the next slide? So I just put this slide together, a few things that we're working on right now as we get ready for lame duck, but then also thinking about the next budget. So kind of depending on what happens in lame duck, we have plans for lame duck, and then we'll have plans for the budget like we're all doing right now. These are just some very important things. You've probably, obviously the Ohio Housing Trust Fund, that is the most significant resource for housing and homeless services in Ohio right now. So we need to maintain that, bolster it, make sure that that stays strong. We're having a lot of conversations right now about predatory housing investors. If you are a property owner, a home owner, you might get calls and text messages all day long, like, oh, I want to buy your house. And just trying to get our arms wrapped around some of these private equity firms that are coming in and buying up properties, which leaves first-time home buyers out of reach with home buying, which leaves them in the rentals, which leaves our folks who need to get into rentals without the rental to get into. So that whole spectrum of housing, this is impacting that. So we're also, of course, going to continue to work on eviction expungement, give people a fresh start so that they can contribute to our communities and have a home and get a job. It's impacting both them getting housing and jobs. So a few other things on here as well. I'll keep moving to the next slide. Happy to answer any questions on that. So Kelsey told me to put together some tips, and sometimes it's hard to start. Like, where do you even begin with advocacy? It can be intimidating, and sometimes you just have to start. You might think, oh, I need this really detailed strategy. I need to get all my ducks in a row. Well, you can do that and you should do that, but sometimes you just have to start, and the time is now. Even in thinking about the next budget, you should be starting those advocacy efforts right now. And so the things that we do here is, we build our relationships, and those one-on-one relationships are extremely important. We also want to have the grassroots part of it. So having the power in numbers to make sure that people understand, our policymakers understand that we have a wide range of support for our issues. Keep things simple, communication, and that communication is all kinds of communication, making sure that you're talking to whoever your legislator is that you're working with that might be championing your issue or hopefully prioritizing your budget issue, that you're communicating with them all the time, as well as continuing to communicate your message. And Nick talked about this, Kelsey talked about this, but repetition, repetition, repetition. You feel like you're saying it all the time, over and over again. And maybe you are saying it to the same person, but you need to keep it up. And because they aren't hearing it as much as you feel like it. They are hearing from so many different people that it's something that you have to kind of get over, like, oh, I've said that same thing 5 times in a row. That's good. That means you're doing the right thing. And then media and press is another key part with our advocacy. And we have a great communications director, Marcus Roth. And yes, here's all the work that he's done. And I would also say on the communications piece, one thing that I feel like has been super helpful is working with the local papers. Of course, you have Gongwer, you have Hannah, and you have, the State House Press Corps, the bigger papers. But I feel like when you work with the smaller papers, that really has a bigger impact with your legislators. They may not care so much about the Columbus Dispatch, but they see something in the Hillsborough Gazette or the Highland Times or the Newark Advocate or whatever the local paper is, that's going to hit home a little bit more. So definitely continuing your work on the media side and social media now too is very important. And then the next slide. So of course, these are things that we all know, just reminders: persuasive, persistent, and polite. These are my P's. We can be passionately persuasive, passionately persistent, passionately but still polite. Another P might be to pray. Just pray that what you're doing is working. All the P's. So, and I would say too, when thinking about the budget in particular, finding a politician who is going to really prioritize your item is key. Who's probably on the finance committee. The main finance committee would be best, or a subcommittee chair. But if you can find a leader who can really champion your issue and is going to prioritize it, because all the members have, so many items that they're going to be pushing for, they really can't push for all of them. But if, so they might have 10 items on their list that they're going to be pushing for. If you know that you have one member who you're number one on their list, and that they're going to be, in the room, really able to help you, that's definitely key. Plenty time in advance, and have your one pager. I know we talk about that all the time, but really you can have your supporting documents, but if you can't put everything you need and you can't highlight your issue on one page, they just won't read it. Just one page. You have to really be able to condense it into a very simple message that they can fight for within their own caucus. So you have to explain it to them, and then they have to be able to explain it to their own leaders within their caucus. So the only other thing that kind of just came to mind was whatever you're working on too, make sure that you have the fiscal agent for that work. So what agency do your dollars go through, and have you talked to that agency and talk to their leader? So hopefully you're in the governor's as introduced budget, but if you're not, hopefully you can coordinate with that agency. So when the leaders go to them and say, hey, I see this money here, it looks like it might go through DRC or it might go through Ohio Department of Health. When they ask those government affairs people for those agencies, if they're good with that, that they're like, oh yes, we support that, or we're fine, or we're neutral, whatever their position is, but just that you've been in communication and that they are aware of what you're working on. So those are my tips. And I guess we'll take questions later, which I'm much better at question and answer.
Gina, thank you so much for that overview. Incredibly important. And you're right, the housing crisis is certainly going to be a major issue and major priority of a number of organizations. I know AOF is going to dig a little bit deeper into it as well next General Assembly. Up next, I'm excited to hear from our partner, Jordan Ballinger, with the Disability Rights Ohio. Jordan, whenever you're ready, please share. We'd love to hear what you have to say.
Great. Thanks, Kelsey. Hi, everyone. My name is Jordan Ballinger. I'm the policy director for DRO. He, him pronouns. I'm going to do a visual description. So I am a white male with glasses, red polo shirt, blonde hair, late 20s. I wish I was still saying early 20s. And then just a blurred out background. So I work for Disability Rights Ohio. We are, you can go to the next slide, thank you, the protection and advocacy system for the state of Ohio. We just recently actually changed our mission to advocate for an equitable Ohio for people with disabilities. And we also just changed our vision, which is why I'm keeping it in here. I usually don't share the vision, but we have changed it, and that is voices elevated, people empowered, equity achieved. So a little bit about DRO. We provide legal and advocacy services to around 7,000 disabled Ohioans every year. This ranges from short-term assistance to litigation to investigations of abuse and neglect. And we do monitoring of facilities that provide services to disabled Ohioans. As the policy director, I focus on our systemic advocacy work for the organization, and our biggest push for that work is the state budget, because that's where a lot of policy initiatives get done in the state of Ohio. Our policy focus starting in 2020, when I took over as policy director, shifted to centering the voices, choices, as an advocacy of disabled advocates. However, obviously we're in the midst of a pandemic, so it was really hard to kind of do that kind of grassroots efforts, which led to us actually hiring a community engagement coordinator. And we've really been honing in on our grassroots efforts here at DRO. So our main kind of budget principle or goal is to increase wages for direct care workers. Since 2021, the budget, we've seen an exacerbation in this crisis for the direct care workforce. We see people going days without receiving care. We see workers struggling to make rent and pay for groceries. Our system just can't compete with any other service system at the moment. Wages for direct care workers around $12 an hour. You can go to many employers and start at 17. And a living wage in Ohio, which we kind of touched on, is around $15 an hour in Ohio. So people are just not able to go into this workforce, which is having a devastating impact. And these services are necessary to keep people in their homes and communities and prevent them from unnecessary institutionalizations. Alternatively, if we continue to not invest in this workforce, we're going to see disabled Ohioans and older adults face institutionalization, which is more costly. And for many Ohioans, especially disabled Ohioans, that is not a place they want to be. A majority of these individuals are wanting to live in their homes and communities. I think you can go to the next slide. Yes. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of our last budget advocacy effort, what we did, and then where we are today and what we're doing. The last budget, we did not have a community engagement coordinator. So we focused largely on the Ohio HCBS coalition and a collective voice and pushing for increase in provider rates. So we are comprised of about 150 organizations, which include the Ohio Statewide Independent Living Council, the DD Council, and the Association of Area Agencies on Aging, and of course, DRO. Go to the next slide. This is a little bit of a history of the coalition. So we actually collectively have been working together, this steering committee, for many years. We are partner organizations through our federal grantors, but it really came about from AOF actually sending a letter to Governor DeWine in the midst of the pandemic, urging for increased investments into home and community-based services. Then we as a group wrote a letter which got about 50 sign-ons, and that group of 50 just began to meet. And then this quickly turned into the Ohio HCBS Coalition, where we set out a mission, goals, objectives, talking points, budget priorities, everything. And our main ask in the budget was a 10% increase in provider rates over the biennium. What we ended up achieving through a lot of hard work, getting several champions in the GA and pushing a central message, was a 6% increase in ODM and ODA, so Department of Medicaid and Department of Aging administered waivers, and 4% in DD or developmental disability administered waivers. Although the governor vetoed the language of that provision, the money was still there and the investments were still made. However, what we have seen since then is the crisis that was already our workforce has intensified dramatically. So what we were hoping to come out of that last state budget, we did not pan out the way we wanted it. So for this state budget, we are going to be focusing very specifically on wages for direct care workers. You can get to the next slide. This is just a mission, our collective mission for the coalition and our website. I didn't know where else to put it in the slideshow, so it's just like randomly in the middle, but that's that. Next slide, thank you. So the coalition itself is going to be advocating generally for an increase in wages. However, what we've been hearing from our coalition partners is an increase in direct care worker wages to at least $18 an hour. This would make us a competitive market. This would be roughly $1 billion or a 50% rate increase to the home and community-based service system, which is a massive amount of money, probably one of the largest investments, but also needed, and eliminate the requirement for non-agency providers to purchase a surety bond. Go to the next slide, please. So what DRO is doing, of course, our core objective this budget is the direct care workforce. However, there are two other things that I didn't put on here that we have also been working on, which is eliminating 14C or sub-minimum wage. So that bill is House Bill 716, which is sponsored by Representative Bridget Kelly and Dontavius Geralds. And then a complete revamp of our mental health system in Ohio. Our mental health system is heavily reliant on nursing homes, jails, and prisons. And we really are wanting people to be able to receive care where they want to receive care. So those are our three main. However, our core focus right now, because of the emergency that does exist, is the direct care workforce crisis. So how we're doing this, like I said, we have shifted how we do things. We are really trying to focus on working with disabled advocates and elevating their voices, specifically through the Ohio Homestead Task Force, breaking silences, and working really closely with Ohio's independent living centers to ensure their voices are being heard with decision makers, and helping coordinate kind of meetings and build relationships with legislators and these individuals. Our budget advocacy is primarily being supported and pushed by disabled advocates and centering them. Additionally, we've been collecting individual stories from those impacted by the direct care workforce. So that's individuals who receive services or direct care workers themselves. And you can go to our website and see some of those stories. We actually just published one a few minutes ago that I just retweeted on Twitter. If you follow me, you'll be able to see that. We're also publishing a story map, and we're going to be doing a report on the direct care workforce crisis here in Ohio. We'll be using these resources to organize advocates and provide information to the legislature, as well as create toolkits to support advocacy for disabled advocates. This budget DRO is focused, like I said, on our grassroots advocacy efforts and really trying to get those individuals into the State House. The last budget, we were very successful in getting an increase in investments. However, a lot of the advocacy was done by professional advocates like myself, and like many of you probably on this call, which is not a criticism. However, we really want to get those who are impacted by the system and impacted by this workforce in front of legislators to tell and share their stories. So, thank you. So we recognize the power of coalition building and elevating individual stories, which is why we are doing a two-pronged approach this budget cycle, which is working with the Ohio HCBS Coalition to continue to push for a central message. That's what made us so powerful last budget, is there were 100 people saying the exact same thing to the legislature over and over and over again. And that's what got us our win. because we're asking for even more money this time, we need to include more voices that aren't just professional advocates, but also disabled advocates who are being impacted by this service system. So that is why we are doing both to kind of shift the needle in our HCBS system. The last thing I want to say, next slide, is we have updated our Public Policy Resource Center. For a long time, it was a landing page for legislation. It has now shifted to be a more dynamic page where you can get involved with our advocacy. We are putting more resources in there, including toolkits, information on how you can share your own story if you're impacted by the direct care workforce, how to contact your legislator, etc. So we're really trying to hone in on that grassroots advocacy for this next state budget. And the last slide is just my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me anytime if you want to get more involved or just have any questions. Thank you.
Jordan, thank you so much. It sounds like you and DRO are certainly ready to hit the ground running for the next state budget cycle. My goodness, you're getting me antsy to get the next our priorities of AOF in order. Again, something that we are in the process of pulling together for that next state budget cycle. Coming up next, I'm really excited to hear from Tim Johnson from the Ohio Poverty Law Center, and it's going to tell us a little bit about OPLC and specifically some work that they're doing on lead abatement and keeping families safe from lead. So Tim, whenever you're ready, please take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Kelsey, and thank you to AOF for having me on today. It's great to be with such great advocates and talking about setting budget priorities, even though it's hard to imagine we're there already. So, but very excited to talk to you all today. So just going to talk a bit about the Ohio Poverty Law Center. We are a statewide nonprofit housed within Ohio State Legal Services Association. We are sister organizations with the Legal Aid Society of Columbus and Southeastern Ohio Legal Services. Well, we actually work with all of Ohio's legal aid programs. For those who don't know, legal aid works on the civil side. So there is the criminal aspect. If somebody's accused of a crime, they get a public defender. But in the civil side, if folks need a lawyer and someone to talk to with various issues, they go to legal aid, and that's who we represent. Our mission is to reduce poverty and increase justice by protecting and expanding the legal rights of Ohioans living, working, and raising their families in poverty. And all of our budget priorities are set by our mission statement and by the issues that legal aid clients are actually facing out in their communities. If you want to go to the next slide. And one of those big issues is lead poisoning prevention. There are a lot of legal aid attorneys who deal with lead poisoning on a daily basis and the impact of that, and they're constantly fighting for their clients to make sure that they have the resources they need to take care of their children who have been affected by lead. And so our role is to look at what we as the Ohio Poverty Law Center can do on a statewide level to make sure that we're doing everything we can to make sure that lead poisoning is something that we're making a thing of the past and trying to tackle. So just want to go over some of the harms of lead poisoning. For those who don't know, lead is a neurotoxin when it is in your blood. And the effects of lead have lifelong impacts, including things like decreased bone and muscle growth, damage to your nervous system, speech and language problems, hearing loss. There are developmental delay issues associated with lead, as well as cognitive problems, possible decrease in your IQ. There was a study done by Case Western Reserve looking at sort of the downstream effects of lead, including the fact that you have a lower chance of being on track and being ready for kindergarten if you're a child who's been affected by lead poisoning. You're more likely to come in contact with the criminal justice system, both the juvenile justice system and as an adult. And you're more likely to require specific public services like homeless services, more likely to need public benefits and other things once you get older. And I just want to point out that all of those things have a cost, right? So whether it is getting additional resources in the classroom for students who are behind because of lead poisoning, whether it's the cost in terms of medical issues, or whether it's the cost of incarceration when you come in contact with the criminal justice system, all of these issues ultimately affect the state because there's a cost associated with that. Next slide. Now I want to talk about the scope of the problem. So lead dust from lead paint is currently the #1 source of how children get poisoned by lead, despite the fact that lead paint has been outlawed since 1978. Currently, over 2/3 of Ohio's housing stock was built before 1980, and it's estimated that nearly 500,000 children under the age of 6 live in these homes, which means that there are a ton of children who are currently at risk for being lead poisoned. So it shouldn't be a surprise that Ohio has the second highest percentage of kids who have elevated blood lead levels in the country. So we're not number one, but we're close, and that is not a good thing. Also, every single county in Ohio has young children in housing with potential lead hazards. However, every county does not have equal resources to work on lead abatement and other issues to make sure that kids are safe from these. So it is an unequal spreading of resources. Some counties have dedicated a ton of resources to fixing this and are doing great work. Others would like to do more, but simply don't have the funding to do so. We also don't do a good job of ensuring homes are lead safe before a child is exposed and making sure that children are tested and following up to make sure that the lead problem is removed once they've already been poisoned. Next slide. So what are the budget priorities in terms of lead poisoning prevention? Well, the Ohio Poverty Law Center is a member of a statewide coalition, the Ohio Lead-Free Kids Coalition. We not only serve on the steering committee, but we are a member of the leadership team. And so one of the things that we're looking to do is use the Lead Poisoning Prevention Fund to expand on the success of the lead safe grants that were implemented last budget. And so a bit of history, the Lead Poisoning Prevention Fund was established in 2004, and despite being in existence for nearly 20 years, has never been funded at any point through the state budget. However, last budget, the Department of Health did get some funding to do a small set of grants, invited local governments and communities to be able to apply for those grants to do lead safe work. The program was very successful, and so we're looking to expand that out and make that a bigger thing by using the Lead Poisoning Prevention Fund, which has been in existence and just never been used. Another budget priority is to allow Ohio to enforce the renovation, repair, and painting rule. This is just a rule that was passed in 2010 by the federal government that says if you're a contractor doing renovation, repair, and painting work in a home, you need to do so in a manner that's lead safe. Common sense, right? We know that lead paint is the #1 source of children getting poisoned. So when you're doing this repair and renovation work, let's make sure we're doing it in a lead safe way. However, the federal government doesn't do a great job of enforcing it. So they allow states to take on the enforcement themselves if they choose. So far, 14 states have taken them up on that offer, and it's actually a really interesting mix of red and blue states. And we want Ohio to be the next state to be able to do that, to enforce this rule, to make sure that our children are safe when this important work is happening within the home. Expand the SCHIP program to bolster prevention efforts and begin track 2 work. So under the Department of Medicaid, they have SCHIP funding. Some of that goes to abating older homes where there have been identified sources of lead poisoning. So a child has been poisoned. We know that there's lead in the home. Let's get people in there. Let's allow them to do the work. But there also should be funding available, and the program was set up this way, in order to get to homes that have yet to have a child be poisoned in them and fix the lead poisoning issues before a child is poisoned. Unfortunately, there's so many backlogged homes that need to be taken care of that they really haven't been able to start this second track work. So increasing funding to make sure they can do that second track and get to kids before they get poisoned is another big priority for us. And then, of course, support the bipartisan proposal to use American Rescue Plan funding for residential lead abatement and lead hazard control. House Bill 587 is currently before the General Assembly, introduced by Representatives Patton and Gerald, which would use American Rescue Plan dollars in order to do a ton of work in terms of making the lead tax credit refundable, making sure that we're using funding for the Department of Development to bolster our workforce to do lead abatement and other lead safe work. And so we're hoping to get that done in lame duck, but if not, we'll be looking at the budget process to see how we can further support that. Next slide. Some challenges with budget advocacy. I know there's a lot of new advocates on here. One of the things that we have found in our budget advocacy that's, makes things very difficult is competing interests within a crowded field. I think Gina said this, there are just a ton of people who are coming before our state legislators asking for multiple different things. And so trying to make sure that your issue stands out and matters to legislators can be incredibly difficult. And it's something I think we struggle with, and it's something that in your budget advocacy you may encounter as well. Making sure legislators understand the issue. Again, repetition. I think a lot of legislators believe that because lead paint was outlawed in the 70s, children don't get lead poisoned anymore. And that's simply not true. In fact, we know Ohio has a huge issue with its housing stock and the number of kids who have elevated blood lead levels. So getting them to understand how important the issue is and that it's still something that's happening on a much larger scale than they can realize. And then understanding the scope and urgency, making sure they understand how widespread the problem is, that it is a statewide problem that every county sees with its kids, and making them understand that we need to get this done as quickly as possible because at the current rate of funding, we're simply not able to tackle the issue in a significant way. And then highlighting successes and managing expectations. So making sure they understand how far we've come on lead poisoning prevention and what we've done in the past, but also letting them know that because it has taken us so long to get here, that it's just not something that's going to be fixed overnight, but we're going to have to keep coming at this problem again and again in different budgets and making sure that we're building upon previous successes. Next slide. All right, I was also asked to give some tips on setting budget priorities. So the first tip, what's your hook? How are you going to pull people in? How are you going to make sure people are tuned into what your issue is and why it should matter, right? I wish I could tell you that because you believe your issue is important, everyone else will, but you really need to figure out what about your issue will help it stand out and what makes it important. It's certainly not more important than any other issue, but there is something about it that you can use to make legislators understand why they should be paying attention to what it is you're asking for when you set your priorities. Also, what issue matters most to you right now and what is your wish list? So when looking at setting priorities, what things specifically do you feel has to be accomplished now? What things can wait? What things are sort of pie in the sky asks? Balancing those things are important because you don't want to ask for something that isn't urgent or necessary and sort of waste your time on advocacy when there are other bigger priorities that you're looking at. So certainly make sure you organize those in a way that makes sense. How can you broaden the appeal of your ask to the widest audience? That's a really important one. You don't want your thing to be too niche, right? When it comes to lead poisoning prevention, for example, a lot of people just assume that it's a problem in urban communities, and it is, and it does disproportionately affect people of color. But like I said, it's in every county, especially in rural counties. A lot of people don't realize that a lot of older housing stock exists in rural counties. So making sure that people understand that this is not just a small problem, but making sure that everybody can understand why this issue is important and why they should care about it. And don't let the definition of a budget constrain you. Policy change should always be on the table. This is for some of our newer advocates. I think a lot of people who have been around before know that a budget just doesn't mean numbers. It is really a policy document with appropriations in it. So don't think that you're asking to be constrained to funding. You should be willing to ask for policy change in the budget. And in fact, some policy change makes more sense to do in the state budget than in other arenas. And then lastly, new ideas are fantastic, but don't be afraid to build off a previous success. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. If you've worked on something that's been good in the past, figure out how you can expand and build upon that, and then use that when setting your priorities. That's always a recipe for success. It gives legislators a reason to come back to you. And then just quick tips on advocacy, because I know I'm running out of time. Who can you bring in to help you? Jordan talked about this, but really having the people most affected by the issue be the ones to help lead your advocacy and come in and talk to legislators and things of that nature is always helpful. They shouldn't just hear from you, but hearing from the affected people is incredibly important. Find the sweet spot when asking for funding, right? Don't lowball yourself, but don't ask for something that also seems unattainable. Figure out exactly where you should be. So making sure that you have some room for negotiations. Like Noah's Ark, bring to a beach when possible. Gina talked about finding your champions, right? If you can find a Republican champion and a Democrat champion, that just increases the likelihood that your issue is going to be heard. Get to know the staffers. Budgets don't happen in a vacuum. It's not just the legislators, but the people behind the scenes. So policy staff, member staff, and other folks. Make sure you know who those people are. Talk to them, take them out for coffee, make sure you're as aware of your issues as the legislators themselves are. Check in with all interested parties and groups. So if your issue affects another group, make sure that you're able to explain to folks you're talking to where those interested party and groups are, so they're not left in the dark and wondering how that might happen. And then last but not least, if possible, consider supporting your activities for your asks. So do things like lobby days, town halls, having legislative reception, sort of whatever you can do that isn't just speaking in committee or having one-on-one meetings with legislators. Figure out other activities that can help bolster the things you're asking for as you go throughout the budget process. And with that, I'll open it up for questions. And there's my contact information should folks need to reach out to me.
Tim, thank you so much for your presentation today. Such great tips and strategies for advocacy. Well said, building upon, again, what our other folks have said so far. And man, what a great roadmap for folks, especially for our newer advocates here on our call today. Very last but not least, I'm really excited to hear from Katherine Ungar today from the Ohio Children's Budget Coalition. And if you haven't caught on yet from today's presentation and our lineup today, we are here highlighting really different coalitions across state advocacy within health and human services. We know that it is so much easier and really more effective to work in coalition with different organizations, again, with a shared mission and goal. Again, you can be so much more effective, and it just opens up that communication to be, again, as effective as you can on the state budget scale and within and with decision makers. It certainly amplifies your voice and your message. So Katherine, we're really excited to have you and please take us away and close us on a high note with the Ohio Children's Budget Coalition.
Thanks, Kelsey, and thank you for having me, Advocates for Ohio's Future. And I just want to say thank you to all the panelists today, many of whom are actually partners in the Ohio Children's Budget Coalition. This is actually our third biennium. Our former executive director, Tracy Nahara, started this 3 budget cycles ago, and I believe it's only sort of grown as our partnerships have gotten stronger and the coalition has broadened. So we're excited to be kicking off the Ohio Children's Budget Coalition for this upcoming biennium. I, like the other speakers, cannot believe it's already here, but we're excited to get to work. And the saying goes within the Ohio Children's Budget Coalition is that, you know, our children are not comprised of pieces, and neither should our policies, our policy priorities in the budget or our investments. You know, I definitely hear that there are a lot of organizations that are very focused on their particular issue, and that's really critical. But the goal of the Ohio Children's Budget Coalition is to sort of have partners learn from one another on how we can support whole child well-being. While children make up 22% of the population, they represent 100% of Ohio's future. We see the budget as a moral document that's a reflection of our priorities. And so what better thing to invest in than our future, our children? We know that the future of Ohio's children rests in large part on the investments we make. And so that's why the Ohio Children's Budget Coalition tries to amplify the priorities of our partners whose issues may touch on children. So while they might not be focused you know, totally on the population of children, we know their issues are integral and impact a child. So for example, we may invest in school, and that's great, but a hungry child can't learn. So we need to make sure we're investing in anti-hunger programs to ensure that they're going to school ready to learn. And we like to find the intersection of those issues and sort of amplify child whole well-being through that lens. You can go to the next slide, please. So here are the partners from last year. I believe 21 so far have signed on this year. We're still in progress to sort of grow this coalition and then continue those who've already been involved. So we're really grateful for those. You can see it sort of spans not only the spectrum of age from early childhood until you know, young adulthood, but it also spans the different topic areas. So Ohio, we're so happy to have you. So we work with on homelessness, and then we also work on the publicly funded childcare side. And you can see the list of our partners, which again is continuing to grow. And I will just give a shout out. If you think your organization would be interested, please, my contact information is at the end of the slide, and I would be happy to have you join us. So I think it's important to sort of lay out what our principles are. This is something we revisit each biennial, and it does change. This is from last year, and so I anticipate a couple amendments, but just what we do is we prioritize the whole child, including the communities they call home and the systems they depend on. We want to improve outcomes and eliminate silos by building a comprehensive, coordinated continuum of services and programs to address issues beyond the artificial boundaries of agencies and funding streams. And I think this is really the crux of the budget coalition, is of the Children's Budget Coalition, is that we don't see it as a fixed pie. We think, particularly in this biennium, we can make significant investments in all of the areas you just heard about, which impacts all of our children, which impacts, you know, the entirety of that child, and is really important if we think about our future. So we don't want to think about it as this fixed pie, but it's actually everyone's issue can be addressed in this budget. We also want to protect essential programs, promote whole child well-being, advance budget solutions that prioritize racial equity and combat the effects of structural racism in our communities, which we know negatively impact child outcomes. We want to support their transition to adulthood. We know there's significant attention to sort of that early childhood, but looking later in life in the early 20s, as we know that's still part of childhood, and they're continuing into successful adulthood. And then ensuring the investments are data-driven. We can go to the next slide. So here are some of the budget priorities that we've already heard from some of our partners, and I'm just going to mention a few, not the ones of which were already mentioned on this call. But in the area of infant maternal health, for example, you know, last biennium, we were really successful in working with multiple partners on getting that 12-month postpartum coverage, continuous coverage passed and then fully implemented as of just a few weeks ago. And for this budget, I know that there will be significant attention to extending Medicaid coverage to cover doula services, as well as continuous coverage for children through age 5. We also know last biennium, we saw some expanded initial eligibility for publicly funded childcare to 142%, but this year, or this biennium, we know that partners will be pushing for up to 200%. Again, as someone mentioned, childcare really being the backbone of the workforce and really essential. We know partners will be advocating for paid family medical leave, of course, in nutrition, protecting access to the SNAP program, funding support for after-school meals, expanding access to school meals, and then in the area of economic mobility and stability, we have partners pushing for strengthening the EITC, consideration of a child tax credit in our state. New Jersey just passed one. It would be really, really impactful for children and families in Ohio. And then last biennium, we worked really hard as the Children's Budget Coalition on the pushing for the Fair School Funding Plan, which did pass, but we want to see investment and full implementation of that plan in this biennium. And the list goes on and on. So I did include a link to our website, which will include all of our archived issue briefs, which partners will each draft, and we put together, consolidate 2-pagers on each of those different issue areas, and then all of the new budget policy briefs for this year. You can go to the next slide. So really, this is our approach. Our approach to advocacy, again, is trying to eliminate those silos and those artificial boundaries of investments, and have our partners sort of work together and learn about the intersections of their policy areas. We know that all investments that prioritize our children are possible and necessary. And what we believe the issue briefs allow, I believe it was Gina who said, you know, have your 2-pager, have those facts down. It allows us to sort of cross-share those issue areas and really quickly learn and digest what our partners might be pushing. And then again, find those intersections so that if I go and meet with a legislator, I can also amplify the message from my partner or their issue brief, or bring it along with me. So that's something that OCBC is planning to do this year, is publish an issue brief book comprised of all of these different issue areas, and then have multiple meetings with administration and legislature that includes multiple members of the Ohio Children's Budget Coalition to discuss that full sort of spectrum of child well-being. We will engage in webinars, lots of social media outreach, Twitter storms. And then I think one thing we're particularly interested in doing this year is more of that information sharing with the general public. It can be really hard to track the way, you know, things pop up in a certain version of the budget, and then that you have to go to the defense. So we want to make sure that we're sharing that information sort of with the public, usually through our social media, so that you can also get involved in this work. And I would just echo what all of the panelists said today about ways to get involved with the budget. And feel free, I've included the link to follow us on Twitter. I know that we will be sharing a lot of information. So I will leave room for questions. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Kelsey. Thank you, Sarah.
Katherine, thank you so much for talking about, again, all the incredible work of the Ohio Children's Budget Coalition. And I want to one more time thank all of our panelists for being here to share your work, to share your advocacy tips today. It's really important. Again, I think, again, the world of advocacy and entering the space can certainly be intimidating, and hearing lived experiences and best practices from our experienced advocates is just so vital. And I thank you for your time and for your expertise and for sharing with us today. So I also want to thank to our panelists who have been addressing questions in the Q&A. You are welcome to keep those coming. We have just a few moments left together of our allotted time frame. But I wanted to actually bring Nick Bates back with us on, if you're available. I know you talked about some of the revenue, again, issues facing the state budget. Could you tell us a little bit more, or re-highlight kind of where our state stands today in terms of revenue? How are those state coffers doing? And maybe a different approach that our state agencies were maybe guided by OBM to take when they think about and they're submitting their new state budget ask. Would love to hear what your thoughts are as to how our state's doing on revenue.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And this is one of the difficult things because of the American Rescue Plan, because of the COVID relief dollars and things. There is revenue available right now to solve big problems. The problem that we need to be aware of is budgets aren't one and done. We are not going to be done with budgeting for Ohio in June, 2023. We need to be ready for where we are going to be as the COVID pandemic relief dollars, as the American Rescue Plan, all these other sources of revenue dry up. And the biggest concern that we have as a revenue coalition that we need our state agencies and our advocates to be ready for is making sure that we have sustainability and adequacy moving forward. So cuts to, we might say, oh, cool, we can flat fund our programs. We can get a 2 or 3% funding increase this year using, COVID relief dollars, ARPA dollars. But then what happens when those dollars run away? What happens when a recession happens, or whatever, the ups and downs of state revenues occur? We have to make sure we have the revenue system in place now to have the revenue that we need for the future.
Nick, thank you so much. I know something that you say a lot that always sticks in my mind is it's not a state budgeting problem. It's a political will problem and a revenue problem. We seem to see a lot of tax breaks and things when state revenue numbers are up, rather than, again, making those really needed and vital investments in services.
Yeah, so I encourage people to really think about what is it going to take to address the problems we see in our communities. What is it, what kind of communities do we want to live in? What kind of schools do we want? What kind of mental health programs do we want? What kind of services do Ohioans deserve? And really begin to communicate that to our policymakers and to elected officials.
Thank you so much, Nick. Seeing no additional questions in the chat or in the Q&A, I want to once again thank our incredible advocates and partners here on the call with us today, and wanted to once again reiterate, I know a number of our panelists said so, but the state budget is, again, it is a revenue document, it is an investment and funding document, but it's also the biggest policy budget and biggest policy bill of the entire General Assembly. So again, no ask is too large or too small, and the opportunity to start discussions or to be successful in the state budget process are really, really great. So encourage you to start that planning and to start those conversations now if you haven't already done so. And of course, would like to highlight our next installment of our Budget Training Academy series coming up in October. We will be coming to you on October 19th for a conversation that will be led by our partners at the Center for Community Solutions, really taking a little bit of a closer look on local, state, and federal perspectives within health and human services. We have a great panel of local health and human service folks, as well as some national speakers as to some major issues coming down in the health and human services space, and really how that planning and how it's going to affect Ohioans in each and every community. So we're excited for that coming up on October 19th. Registration is open, as well as our final budget training Academy, we're calling it the Summit. This will be coming up on December 6th. That's a Tuesday, so we will be in person in Columbus on that day. We are preparing a number of panels of administration officials, of elected officials, of budget policy staff from the General Assembly to join us to talk about, again, what their priorities are, what they expect the process to be coming up the next state budget cycle, and some of their intended priorities, and then some of the issues that they hope to see in the next state budget cycle. That will be happening again from 11:30 to 4:15 on December 6th. So we'll be in the height of lame duck session, lots of conversations to be had, as well as lots of networking to be accomplished with fellow health and human service stakeholders. So once again, a quick reminder that the recording and slides, as well as links to a lot of additional opportunities, as well as signups, will be included in a follow-up email to all registrants coming up either later today or first thing tomorrow. And of course, everything is available at our website, and including recordings from past sessions at advocatesforohio'sfuture.org. Once again, my name is Kelsey Berkfeld with Advocates for Ohio's Future. I want to thank you for your time and attention today, and happy budget planning. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.